Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here for Alex's proposal presentation. And uh, so it's been a funny COVID year, and I know this is not at all about me, but it's been really fun working with Alex over Zoom and by email. But, in a typical non-COVID year, my grad students are in and out of my office on campus all the time just to sit down and say, hey, I had this really great reading, or oh my gosh, I'm really stuck with something. And so I've really missed that face-to-face opportunity with Alex. And I'm hoping in the fall we'll kind of get back to some normalcy, and with you, Tracy, to just be able to see people on campus and to be working in that way. But Alex doesn't need an introduction, but I will introduce him. He has a really interesting background, and what I really like about his background is that it's forest policy related, which is my background, and he kind of approached me about working on a master's degree in environmental policy to really complement the great work that he's already been doing. So he grew up in Southern Oregon, graduated from the University of Oregon with a degree in philosophy and political science. And in the meantime, he has worked for Oregon Wild, the Sierra Club, and a number of other environmental nonprofits working on forest conservation, forest policy, and climate adaptation. And he's working currently with a really diverse group of stakeholders to develop a community forest in the South Fork Nooksack River Valley. And it is that interest that really compelled him to pursue a master's. So here's the title of his project. It's a case study analysis to evaluate which model of community forestry is optimal for salmonid recovery in the Nooksack watershed. We may have to shorten that a little bit, Alex, but let's go for it. It's all yours.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Grace. Let me share my screen. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexander Harris. I'm a graduate student at Western Washington University, and today I'm going to give you a short introduction to my graduate research project, which is focused on the Stewart Mountain Community Forest and other community forests throughout the Pacific Northwest. The chief objective of my community forest is to answer this research question: which model of community forestry is most conducive to restoring the Nooksack watershed and recovering salmonid populations? I will be circling back to this research question later in the presentation, so hopefully that jumble of words makes more sense at the end. This is an outline of what I'll be covering in the presentation. I'll start with an introduction where I give you some more background on the issue. I'll then go through a literature review very briefly, where I highlight some of the most pertinent scientific articles and studies that relate to my research. I'll then go over the Stewart Mountain Community Forest and what it is and where it's at now. And I'll conclude with a brief overview of my methodology, essentially how I plan to implement my research over the coming year. So starting at the top with the introduction. This is a photo I took from Stewart Mountain looking east. You see Mount Baker on the left and the Twin Sisters on the right. And in the foreground is the South Fork Nooksack River Valley. My partner and I live in the community of Van Zandt, which is highlighted there with that red arrow. You can see how beautiful this place is. This is what makes me so passionate to work with the local community to find a way to restore salmon populations and really change the way that we manage our natural resources in the region. Here's a map of the South Fork watershed. At the very top here is the confluence with the North Fork near Deming, Washington. All of the yellow and red lines you see on this map are fish-bearing streams or rivers. So some of these areas are the extent of salmonid populations that are anadromous, so seafaring salmon that spend most of their life at sea and come back to spawn. Some of these red and yellow lines are only available and open to char species and other species that are not anadromous. But the point here is that fish are throughout this watershed. I do want to draw your attention to the blue lines on this map. Those are the non-fish bearing streams. I will be demonstrating, hopefully convincing you, that these blue lines are very important for salmon recovery. Even though fish don't live in these streams, they are still very important to contributing to salmon habitat and water quality that supports salmon. So sometimes with salmon recovery, it can become a little bit more intellectual and controversial, and you're talking about the policies and restoration strategies. I think it's important to pause and remember that these are real fish in the watershed. A friend of mine took this footage about a year ago in the South Fork. This is the spring Chinook run, which is one of the most endangered salmon populations in the region. This run has supported the Nooksack people as well as other tribes in the region for time immemorial, truly for millennia. This salmon run has supported the economy and the culture of these tribal peoples. Unfortunately, today, salmon in the Northwest are declining. This is these are graphs showing salmon declines of Chinook and steelhead over the past several decades in the Puget Sound region. Originally, the Pacific Northwest hosted around 1,400 runs or populations. 30% of those runs to date have been lost. They have become locally extinct. Of the remaining 70% of runs that still do exist, their populations are roughly 5% on average of their historic levels. I want to highlight these are wild salmon runs. The remaining fish that we have in our watersheds in the Pacific Northwest, most of them are hatchery fish. There are, of course, many problems with hatchery fish. I will not be getting into those because of the brevity of this presentation, but you can see the problem is very dire, and it really requires us to think innovatively of how we solve this problem. This salmon decline problem is complex. It's diverse, numerous causes of the problem. I won't be getting into all of those. I do want to talk about 3 water quality and quantity parameters that are very important in contributing to salmoniid decline in the South Fork. One is temperature. There's too much solar radiation. There's too little shade provided for the South Fork watershed, which contributes to higher temperatures in the watershed. The South Fork is actually an impaired waterway under the Clean Water Act. Section 303D of the Clean Water Act lists all the parameters for watersheds, and South Fork violates those parameters for temperature as well as for turbidity. In other words, the water has too much sediment in it. The South Fork also is plagued by a third impairment, which is low summer stream flow. In other words, there's not enough water in the watershed during summer months when fish and when farmers and people need it the most. So with that background, let me go through some of the literature that I'll be reviewing in my research. Industrial forestry has had a dramatic impact on the South Fork watershed over the last 150 years. The dominant land use in the watershed is commercial forestry. So the majority of the watershed's area is commercial forestry use. And there's a long legacy of commercial logging in the watershed. From the time that European settlers first came here in the 19th century to now, there has been extensive logging activity. There are a variety of different ownerships in the watershed. There's private ownerships that are owned by Weyerhaeuser and Sierra Pacific Industries. Those are the 2 largest private landowners in Whatcom County. They're also the 2 largest landowners in the United States. So some of the biggest timber operators in the country are present and actively operating right here in the South Fork watershed. There's also quite a bit of state land owned and by the state, managed by the Department of Natural Resources, DNR. That land is primarily managed for timber production, not as aggressively logged as private land, but still primarily timberland. It's managed on even-aged, clear-cut plantation rotations. There is some federal land in the furthest extent of the watershed that's managed by the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, but it is a small fraction of the total watershed. So I've already used the term industrial forestry a few times. Let me just take a minute to explain what that term means. Let me draw your attention to the top left. This is a time lapse, 1980s. Watch in the late 90s how Stewart Mountain here almost uniformly is stripped of all of its mature second growth forest and replaced with plantation. This is the South Fork River here. Here's the community of Van Zant where I live. And I'll let this go through one more time. Watch the extent of logging across Stewart Mountain throughout the late 90s and early 2000s. It's truly stunning to see. This is what a clear cut looks like on the ground. These are oftentimes over 100 acres on private land and sometimes state land. And it's known as even-aged management, meaning almost every single tree is taken with few trees remaining. And the replacing trees are all usually the same species and the same age. This is known as even-age management in the forestry world. I call it clear-cut plantation forestry because it describes the clear cuts and the plantations that replace those clear cuts. This is what a plantation looks like when it becomes 50 or so years old, maybe 40 years old. Notice there's no foliage on these trees except for at the canopy. There's little to no understory, and all the trees are densely packed together. Of course, this is not really a forest ecosystem as much as it is a tree plantation. I want to show those images to get your head around what industrial forestry is. Now let me explain what industrial forestry does to the watershed. There's been some really great research over the last few years coming out of Oregon State University about the impacts industrial forestry has on water quantity. These researchers in these two different studies compiled 60 years of data from 3 different experimental forests throughout Oregon. One of them was the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest east of Eugene. Another one was down in the Umpqua Drainage. Another one was in the Coast Range of Oregon. So there's different parts of Oregon. They compared 60 years of data. One of these research plots in each of these experimental forests was logged. The other one was unlogged. So in other words, they identified similar adjacent basins, logged one of them, replaced it with a plantation, did nothing to the other. The result was pretty stunning. The researchers found that the logged basin produced 50% less water in summer months than the unlogged basin. What's even more surprising to me is that these deficits in summer stream flow persisted for decades. In other words, there was a dramatic reduction in summer stream flow lasting for numerous decades. This has huge implications for forest management in the 21st century because clear cuts today will mean less water in the future, especially in the latter half of the 21st century when we see climate impacts beginning to ramp up to a scope and scale that truly disrupts hydrologic systems and salmon populations and much else. So that was water quantity. There's been a ton of work done on water quality and how industrial forestry has contributed to adverse impacts on water quality. Instead of going through all these different studies, I chose a science synthesis conducted by Forest Service researchers about 10 years ago. They surveyed 100 peer-reviewed articles and found a direct correlation between clear-cut logging and increases in peak flows. Peak flows are those periods, usually during the winter or spring, when the hydrologic system receives its greatest amount of water. These are generally associated with more flooding, more landslides, and more mass wasting, so more erosion in the watershed. That increases sediment in the watershed and turbidity, increases temperatures over time as it confines the river to a more simple channel and disconnects the river from its historic floodplain. And of course, there's less sinuosity over time. The more of these peak flows you have, the simpler the system becomes. Of course, this is kind of generalizing, but I'm generalizing for the sake of time. So what is the alternative to industrial forestry? Well, I will be using the term ecological forestry to describe the alternative approach. Ecological forestry is essentially managing a forest as an ecosystem instead of as a crop. You see the photo here on the right. This is a managed landscape in which wood products are being extracted, but what remains is a forest. A forest still remains after the thinning work has been done. The idea with ecological forestry is to recognize the multiple values that forests provide and to manage to promote those multiple values. I'll very quickly go through some of these comparisons between industrial forestry and ecological forestry to help you parse out the difference. Industrial forestry generally relies on clear cutting, even age management. Ecological foresters generally pursue selective thinning, small gap cutting. There's short rotations on industrial land, whereas ecological foresters will pursue longer rotations, letting trees go longer before harvest. Ecological foresters also prefer a more multi-aged, complex forest management regime, whereas industrial forestry prefers the more uniform, even-age regime. Industrial forestry is more single species plantations, whereas in ecological forestry, when they replant, they try to replant a variety of tree species. And then, of course, there's greater buffers around streams. In ecological forestry, there's minimal logging on steep slopes and unstable areas when compared to industrial forestry. So those are some of the differences between the two models. Now let me explain community forestry and how it fits into all of this. For me, community forestry is applying ecological forestry at scale and really democratizing natural resource management to ensure that a forest is managed for numerous values and uses. A really important part of this is engaging the community to ascertain what the priorities are of that community. So there's an engagement part. Once you learn what the community is interested in, you then create a management regime that still extracts wood products while maintaining other values, recreation and habitat and watershed protection and whatnot. There's been a lot of work on community forestry, especially in the state of Washington over the last 10 to 15 years. Especially in the last 5 years, there seems to be somewhat of an explosion of community forests proliferating around the state. I will be reviewing some of these documents that are summing up lessons learned from these different models. One of my foundational documents will be this research paper compiled by UW and University of Montana researchers a few years ago. This paper does a great job at choosing a variety of case examples, some in New England, some in the Northwest. There's actually one in British Columbia and some in Northern California. And they do a great job looking at the different models and summing up lessons learned from each model. Okay, so now let me tell you more about the Stewart Mountain Community Forest. Stewart Mountain Community Forest is a collaborative effort to adopt 6,000 acres of forest land into local ownership to be managed for a wide range of ecological, economic, and community benefits. The key stakeholders involved in this project are Whatcom Land Trust, the Nooksack Indian Tribe, Evergreen Land Trust, which is the nonprofit that I am a contractor for, Whatcom County, and Western Washington University, which is recently getting engaged through my engagement, through Dean Hollenhorst's engagement, and others. The chief objective of this community forest is to restore the South Fork watershed and recover salmonid populations through the application of ecological forestry at scale. Other objectives include promoting economic development in the South Fork Valley, expanding recreational access on Stewart Mountain, producing high quality, large diameter wood products in perpetuity, and bolstering community autonomy. To give you context of where this proposed community forest is located, I'll bring your attention to the right, that's Mount Baker, and on the left is the city of Bellingham. This red circle in the center is where I live, which is the community of Van Zant, and you see the South Fork Valley to the south. This is an overlay of different ownerships, the blue being state-owned lands, the gold and yellow being county-owned. Notice this is Stewart Mountain here. This is where the proposed community forest is located. It's 6,000 acres in size, and it is adjacent to the South Fork itself. So here's a different view of Stewart Mountain. There's Van Zant and there's Bellingham, Lake Whatcom. This is where the community forest is proposed. It would be on these steep slopes that are currently managed industrially by a landowner, and it would be bringing this forest into local ownership to be managed for a variety of purposes. So where does my research come in? Well, my goal is to ascertain which model of community forestry is best suited for the stated goals of the Stewart Mountain Community Forest. My methodology will be guided by a variety of questions. What are the various models of community forestry? What are the advantages and drawbacks of each model? And which model is most conducive to watershed restoration? Here's a timetable to show you how I plan to implement my research over the next year. I've already done quite a bit of work on this, and I will be concluding in 13 or 14 months from now. Phase 1 of the community forest, or of my research project, is concluding really today. Defending my graduate research proposal, you'll see, is this last item on phase 1. I've already begun phase 2, which is to conduct an inventory of all Pacific Northwest community forests, create a typology that categorizes all of those different community forests based on their ownership and their governance models. I will then identify 6 case examples and build a profile for each case example. The way I'm going to build those profiles is by conducting interviews with stakeholders to learn more about the background of the community forest and the stated objectives. I'll also be reviewing planning documents, maps, technical documents to learn more about what these different stakeholders have put together as their objectives for the forest. And I also plan to conduct a site visit to each case example. So I'll be traveling a lot this summer to 6 different locations to see what these community forests look like on the ground. Case examples I've created so far, I'm really just beginning to identify what the 6 are, but I've identified 3. I'll share them really quickly with you. Nisqually Community Forest, this is a no-brainer. This will be probably the most important community forest I review because it's the most similar to what we're trying to do up here in Whatcom County. Phase 1 of the community forest is just under 2,000 acres. They've completed that acquisition. Phase 2 was a proposed 1,280 acres. That was just 2 weeks ago approved by the Washington State Legislature. The state of Washington just created a new community forest program that creates a pot of money for communities to buy their own community forest and develop their own forest. So they just got that, and their phase 2 will now be expanding their community forest by about 1,300 acres. The location is in the Michelle watershed, which is in the upper Nisqually watershed at the foot of Mount Rainier, if you can imagine that area. Their chief focus is salmon recovery. They have other objectives as well, but really the motivating impetus behind this project is to recover steelhead populations and Chinook populations. There's a mixed ownership and governance model that I think is very exciting. I will be drilling deep into that to learn how they've organized it, because there could be some lessons we learn for our project up here on Stewart Mountain. The second case example I've identified is the Teanaway Community Forest. This is a 50,000 acre community forest, very large. In terms of scale, this is probably the largest community forest I've heard of. The Washington legislature several years ago allocated $100 million to acquire this large community forest. This community forest is one of two of community forests that are owned and managed by the state. The Department of Natural Resources, DNR, manages the Teanaway, and I think it's a really cool case example to learn how the state is getting involved in community forestry. The focus is watershed restoration, recreation, and other objectives. And I'm really excited to learn more about how they've been able to bring this project together and somehow convince the state to take it on. I don't know how they did it, but I'm excited to learn. The third case example I'll be reviewing is Canyon Lake Community Forest. This is a small 2,300 acre forest that includes 800 acres of old growth. It's located in the Mount Baker foothills. The focus of the forest is conservation and recreation. It is co-owned in a dual ownership model by Whatcom County and Western Washington University. Really cool split ownership model. However, the major problem with this forest is that there's no vehicular access, and therefore there's no management up in that forest. There's no, there's little recreation up there. You have to hike on a logging road for about 5 miles. Definitely worth it, but not a great hike. Not very fun to be on that logging road for hours. All right, so those are my 3 case examples I've developed so far. I need to develop 3 more, which I'll do in the next month or so. Phase 4 of my research will be designing my evaluation criteria, essentially figuring out how I'm going to analyze the benefits and drawbacks of each model. And then, of course, in this phase, I need to conduct the analysis itself. This will be also one of those very lengthy and difficult items that I'm still figuring out the details of how I'll be doing this. But the analysis will hopefully get me closer to my final recommendation, which is phase 5. I'll produce a written recommendation to the Stewart Mountain stakeholders describing which model I think is best for this collaborative effort and why I believe that's the case. Then about a year from now, I'll defend my research project before this committee. Here's my works cited. This presentation is being recorded, so if you're interested in digging deeper into any of this work, go ahead and press pause here and you can review that. And with that, I wanted to conclude by really explaining why I think community forestry is so important. I think community forestry can be a very powerful tool to bring communities together, to bring all these different stakeholders together and solve really difficult problems. Especially in the face of climate change, we really need to think innovatively about how we restore salmon populations. And I believe community forestry is an innovative and potentially successful approach to mobilizing a community around numerous values of a forest. So I would love to hear your feedback and your questions, and I'm looking forward to working with you all on this project. Thank you.